Did you know that you can get a free confident communication coaching session with me? It's true, you can. You just need to be willing to let me publish it as a podcast episode. Why? Because we learn by working out loud. And if you go back and have a listen to episode 177, Sales Conversations That Feel Fabulous with Caitlin, who is a business owner and a pet photographer, you'll see exactly what I mean. So the confident communication coaching sessions last for 30 minutes. You can bring any communication challenge to the table that you want, including the one that we're talking about today in today's podcast, getting a seat at the table, and we will work through it. We will work through it. And it's entirely free so long as you're okay with me publishing it unedited, untouched as a podcast episode. The link to book is in my show notes. And I really look forward to seeing you soon. Welcome to another episode, I should say, of Speaking with Confidence. I'm Cat Matson, and on this show, I coach business owners, impact-minded leaders, and humble leaders how to speak with authority, authenticity, confidence, and with impact so you can make your difference. You can make your contribution in the world. And oh my goodness, doesn't getting a seat at the table represent that whole notion of making your desired impact in the world? So yeah, that's what we're talking about today. How do you get a seat at the table? Because when I talk about contributing to the conversations that matter, you need to be in the conversations that matter. And one of the things that comes up a lot when I'm talking to women, particularly those working in large corporate structures, public sector or otherwise, they struggle to be invited. They're not senior enough to be in the conversations that matter. They don't feel like they're contributing to the decision making, to the policy making. They have ideas and insights and experience that would be highly, highly, highly valuable, but they're not at the table. They're not part of the conversation. And so I wanted to talk about that today because I don't think I can have these conversations about speaking with confidence if I'm not also acknowledging that it can be really hard to get a seat at the table. I also just want to acknowledge up front that I am a little nervous about this particular topic because the things that I am going to say are not going to be what normal feminists would say about how to get a seat at the table. And I'm fully conscious that I might annoy a few people. I might pee a few people off, and it might invoke a little bit of outrage. And I'm a normal human being. I don't like offending people, but I do feel that this is an important conversation to have. So let's dive in. First up, if you're new to this, welcome. If you're new to this podcast, welcome. My name's Kat, and I have spent my entire career speaking, educating and informing, including best part of 10 years working in the public sector. And until I was in the public sector, I was always wanting to be at the tables. I was always wanting to be at the tables where decisions were being made. And then even when I got into the public sector and I had a role that should have had me be at the tables, I wasn't always at the table. So I have lived experience of this, and I have deep, deep, deep lived experience of being part of policy making, decision making, advisory boards. I've seen how the power plays play out. That's why I do this work now. And I can say all of this conversation comes from that place of lived experience. It does not come from a textbook, and it doesn't come from, I'm going to say, from career guidance counselling perspective. It comes from what works. It comes from how people actually play. So the first thing that I want to say here is when we are striving to get a seat at the table, it's because we have some pretty strong freaking opinions about a something. We want to be part of the solution. We want to be part of the policy. We want our voice to be heard. And when we are determined and passionate and riled up about something, one of the things that can happen is that we can get filled with moral outrage and righteous indignation. Just this notion of, why aren't they listening? Why won't anybody see how ludicrous this is? We see this on social media all of the time. People yelling into their own echo chambers of opinions. The first thing that I really want to say on this one, and this was hard learned in the public sector, no one wants to hear your righteous indignation or your moral outrage, even if it's true, even if it's valid. People of both genders are labelled troublemakers, or once they're labelled troublemakers because they are emphatic, because they pull stunts, because they yell, because they carry on. They're not easy people to communicate with, and so they're not invited to those conversations. And this can be a really bitter pill to swallow, because particularly true hippies, and that's why I call myself a corporate hippie, true hippies will be all for the protest, all for the make a noise. And there's a place for that. Don't get me wrong, there is a place for that. But in day-to-day corporate and public sector conversations, the people at the top are just trying to get their job done. The people a few layers down from the top are just trying to get their job done. And moral outrage and righteous indignation and people who are slamming the table and getting hot and bothered and running off to the tabloid news to call out all sorts of behaviour, they just make life difficult, and they're not easy to work with. And so when you think about just literally the day-to-dayness of the conversations that you're influencing, you want to be someone who maybe is easy to work with. You want to be someone who can not be an unpleasant person to be around. And this is why I was nervous about this conversation, because that actually flies in the face of our passion sometimes. So the approach that I took once I realised how the dynamics worked, how the power dynamics work in public sector and corporate organisations, is you get more flies with honey. And that is not to say that I appease or bend over backwards or accommodate, but it's how do I facilitate a conversation for an outcome rather than argue for a conversation, rather than have people feel bad. The other thing too is that when you're in that moral outrage or righteous indignation space, you tend to make other people's opinions wrong. And here's the thing, no one likes being wrong. No one. And when you are consistently known for making people wrong, they're just going to get more defensive. They're just going to dig their heels in, because that's human nature. That is human nature. It's not because of the patriarchy. It's not because they're politicians who just want to protect their roles. It's not because they're senior leaders who just want to protect their patch. It's because it's human nature. And when we sit in that reality, as uncomfortable as it might be sometimes, we can then take a more proactive, a more constructive, and a more useful approach to getting a seat at those proverbial tables. So let's get into that. First of all, recognise that despite appearances, decisions don't just happen at the table. In fact, decisions are often happening well before they get to the table, and the table is just where they're formalised. And yes, I know I'm talking in abstracts because the table is different in different constructs, in different contexts. So the first question to ask yourself when you're trying to be more influential, when you're trying to get your seat at the table, is ask yourself, who else is informing the conversations that are happening at the table? Who else is, they might not be at the table themselves either, but who else is informing? Now, If you watch the dynamics of an organisation for long enough, you'll see this. You'll also see it if you're going for a bigger cause, like something that's political. You'll also see this in news reports. You'll see similar names popping up, and you'll see the patterns. As a side note for Australian listeners, you might be familiar with the TV show Utopia. It's a working dog production. And, it's a satire of the ridiculousness that can happen in the public sector sometimes. And Rob Stitch, who's the executive producer, was asked once, where do you get your stories from? And he said, the news. Like, I just watch how this stuff plays out. So it's not a mystery. If Rob Stitch and his team can create Utopia and it's pretty accurate, you can also read the news and see who's informing. So in your organisation, who else is informing those at the table? And how can you build relationships with those people? How do you have your message, your insights, your opinions be heard by those people? This then leads me to point number 2, and this is being consistent and constructive with your messages over time. Influence takes time. Reputation takes time. In fact, a positive reputation takes a long time to build, but only seconds to destroy. And by being consistent and constructive in your messaging to all of the relevant people who will hear it, you will eventually get an invite to the table. I saw this play out in one of my roles in the public sector. I was fortunate enough to have a very high-profile role, so I had audiences, but oftentimes I didn't have power. And one of the things that I learned fairly quickly was that if I said the same things, for example, about innovation, and that was one of my things, it was to drive the innovation ecosystem. And so I would say on stages when I'm talking about innovation, I'd say things like innovation is messy. Innovation is messy. Innovation is not new. Innovation is messy. And so various people would hear that message and it became a soundbite, and I became known, or one of the things I became known for, innovation is messy. And so whilst that's happening publicly with people who understood, they were kind of my audiences, I was preaching to the converted, but I was still trying to inform policy and politicians. And a few years down the track, the Lord Mayor got up one day and said, as our CDO, Cat Matson, says, innovation is messy. And I smiled deeply at that. But once I knew that he had that message, I could then use that message again in informing the policy, when they were looking to mitigate the risk, or when they're looking for a nice, clean, neat path, I'd say, remember, innovation is messy. You have so many different ears that your message can land on, and it's not just about the people at the table. And depending on what it is that you're advocating for, depending what it is that you're trying to change, depending what your motivations are for being at the table, being, I'm going to say, clever and strategic about who else hears your message can be really powerful. Sometimes this means that you won't get credit for a message. Somebody, you'll say the same things over and over again, and maybe somebody else will pick it up and it'll circle back to you. And in true change leadership, in true thought leadership, you just need to be okay with that. Because if you want the credit for everything, then hey, we're not going to get much done at all. So being consistent, being constructive, and being constructive with your messages over time. I think what I mean too here about the being constructive is that there are times when what you're advocating for is really different. It requires a change, and change has risk. And so by being constructive, what I mean is you also need to show how those risks will be managed. Not just dismissing them, you need to show how they're going to be managed. You need to show that you've got solutions, that you've thought through things, and that you understand that there's risk involved. Because when you just dismiss them, the risk you take is that people think that you're just an idealist, that you don't understand the complexities of the environment that you work in. Ask me how I know. The final piece that I want to say on this is understand that influence is best done over time. You are not going to change anyone's mind in one conversation. You are not going to get an invitation to the table as a result of just one conversation. Being invited into those conversations, getting a seat at the table, requires a very long-term view, a very long-term view. And the persistence to show up over and over and over and over and over again and over and over and over again a bit more. You will be so tired of your message and people will just start to hear it. And I think this patience piece, patience with persistence, is really, really important. No one is sitting around those tables saying, how do we keep these other people out? It just doesn't occur to them to bring people in. And what will have it occur to them is when they hear different perspectives, when they see that there are credible, meaningful people who can help them get their agenda, who can help them do their jobs, who can help make their lives easier. So constantly scanning for the what's in it for them is also really powerful. I'm going to leave it there because I feel like that, excuse me, covers it for today. I just do want to close though and recognize and acknowledge that the table itself is not necessarily where the influence is. I know sometimes it looks like that, but sometimes it's 3 steps before the table. Sometimes it's a key influencer or a key advisor. So looking at who's around the table, talking to them, asking them questions, offering to help, that is a powerful way to get a seat at the table. The final thing, because it just occurred to me, and so I now need to say it even though I've started wrapping up, is if you have a change that you are leading that is so big and you can't get a seat at the table that you need to get a seat at, create your own table, create your own event, create your own podcast, create your own stage where you're putting your message out there. That is the other way to get a seat at the table. Create your own table, invite the people that you want, and speak up. If that's something of interest to you, then I would please reach out. We can talk more about that. So that's enough for today's conversation around how to get a seat at the table. If you have further questions about that, can you ask, please? Don't just sit there and go, oh man, that just all sounds too hard. Or, oh gee, she's full of garbage. Ask. Best way to do that, if you're listening on Spotify, just ask in the comments below. Or if you're not listening on Spotify, find me on Instagram at Cat Matson and ask away. Of course, the other thing that I want to remind you of is the Confident Communication Coaching Call, completely free. And if you want some specific strategies on how to get a seat at the table, that's exactly something we can have a chat about. So it's free as long as you're willing to let me use it as a podcast episode. Just follow the link in the show notes and we can get stuck into it. I hope that's been a useful conversation for you. I really do. And if it was confronting, I would love to know where I pushed your buttons or where you just fundamentally disagree, because we also need more of that respectful disagreement. Until next week, have a fabulous week and doing whatever it is that you're doing. And here's to confidence and here's to impact. I'll see you soon.